first of all, let me thank you and all the supporters for inviting me to this opportunity to present on this research that was done some time ago. I am a historical archaeologist. I'm a professor emeritus of anthropology now at Western Michigan University. And the image that you're seeing on the screen right now is actually of our excavations at 18th century French trading post of Fort St. Joseph. And when I first received the invitation from Jeannie, we would have participated in a larger conference that was going to look at Fort St. Joseph and other French forts in the Western Great Lakes region. But I've also done some research on the Underground Railroad, and so let me tell you a little bit about what we've been doing. So let's see, I'm sharing my screen, and let me do this, and here's my full screen coming up. Okay, very good. Jeannie, give me a thumbs up if you can see that. Okay, 2 thumbs up. That's good. Okay, very good. So, my original title was something to the effect of the archaeology of the Underground Railroad in Southwest Michigan. And so the digging part is not a misnomer, but it's more of a metaphor. And you'll understand that, I think, as we go through. So let's launch into this. But I am going to talk about the Underground Railroad and the archaeological remains in Southwest Michigan. So here's my talking points for the next 45 minutes or so. I want to tell you a little bit more about who I am and more so my approach to the research that I do, because I'm a firm believer that positionality, right, one's identity and one's theoretical perspective and the research questions one asks will very much dictate the kinds of information that's derived in a research project. So I want to tell you a little bit more about that. And of course, we'll delve into this elusive Underground Railroad, talk a little bit about why it's been so elusive to conduct research on, for example. I'll give you a little timeline of African-American history. I mean, obviously, we could take 20 volumes to do that. And I'm going to just do it a little thumbnail sketch here to place the Underground Railroad within that historical context. And I want to underscore throughout that people who were involved in the Underground Railroad, namely the freedom seekers themselves, the people who were escaping bondage from the American South, resisted enslavement for a very long time. I mean, we have to really think about these people as self-liberators. A lot of the emphasis has been placed on, let me just say, white Quakers that have helped in the Underground Railroad, and their role was important. And we have to remember that folks were resisting when they started jumping off ships, right, on their way out of Africa and so forth. So there's a long, long history of resisting enslavement, and we want to underscore and lift that up in the discussion. I'll talk to you about some of the historical evidence that we found of the Underground Railroad in Southwest Michigan. And of course, since this is all about archaeology, we're going to talk also about how we search for clues and then piece the story together. And I am going to show you some images of some materials that we think relate directly to the Underground Railroad. So let's get started. So I'm what I refer to as a social archaeologist, not social in like a social distancing way, but more like someone who studies social relationships in the past. So I'm particularly interested in the way social inequalities were created and how they're maintained, particularly through the material world. I'll mention that I'm white, male, cisgendered, and so forth. And all of these aspects of my identity influence the way I approach this work. So as I said, my overarching research question has to do with systems of inequality and how they are created and maintained. And certainly enslavement, right, was a huge system of inequality, right? That's a complete understatement. And I'll delve into that a little bit more. Let's see if we can get to our. And as an archaeologist, the way that my entry point into understanding that question is in the materiality of people's lives. So these are the objects that they made, they used, and they discarded, right? And I would argue that the selectivity that goes into that and the modifications of those objects and the places they're discarded are expressions of the lives of these people. And so we can use them as an entry point into understanding who they were and what they did. So that's the trick, is reading this material record, right, for clues about the past. And that's what archaeologists do. So you can think of archaeology, there's at least two metaphors for archaeology. One is one of discovery and treasure, right? And the other is more one of clues and detective work. So that's really what we're emphasizing is really, how do we do this detective work and decipher these remains? And then let me just end this section by saying a little bit about a little note on language, right? And the importance of language. I try to be careful with the language that I use. I mean, for a long time, people of African descent who were held in bondage were referred to as slaves. But the preference is really to refer to them as enslaved, right? Because this was not of their doing, right, if you will. The other thing is sometimes we'd refer to slaves, we'd refer to masters, right? And then some have argued, well, these people really weren't masters of anything, right? We should really call them what they were enslavers, right? So I think it's important to, to use language that does justice to the people who are part of the story. And I think, that's part of what I want to emphasize there. Okay, so this elusive Underground Railroad. So what was the Underground Railroad? I'm sure many, if not most of you know, but I'll start off by saying it really wasn't underground and it really wasn't a railroad, right? So it's important to get that myth out of the way. But it is a clandestine network of people and places on the landscape that were physical clues, were aids to people who were enslaved in the American South, who sought their freedom, who were seeking freedom. And that network extended from the Ohio River, and we just focused sort of like now in the mid-continent now. I mean, there are other aspects of it. People were escaping from Florida to the Bahamas and other Caribbean islands and so forth. But really the focus here is on the Midwest. And so from the Ohio River, points in north of Kentucky, southern Ohio, southern Indiana, and so forth, all the way into Michigan and ultimately to Canada. So it's that network. So why is it so elusive? Well, because basically if you were involved in it, you were breaking the law, right? It was generally against the law to help folks who were engaged in this activity, who were escaping bondage, right? This was seen as being against the law. So as a result, people often didn't write about it. They might not be very overt in their communications about it. They might not have left much in the way of records. Hiding places were indeed concealed, even after the fact and so forth. So it's difficult to get information on the Underground Railroad. It's not to say that there isn't information that exists, though. So there have been lots of efforts to document the Underground Railroad, and our effort is a small is a way that we're trying to contribute to this larger cause. So there are oral histories that exist, right? There are accounts of freedom seekers. So shortly after emancipation, even some folks who had escaped from bondage were interviewed, and their accounts have been recorded. There were runaway slave ads, right? So what clear evidence of essentially escape than the ads themselves, where enslavers would write, I want my property, air quotes, right, back. Johnny has a big gash above his eye. He walks with a limp, parenthetically, because he was beaten on multiple occasions. And I want him back, right? And so they would advertise, and there would be rewards and the like for this. So all of this is part of an effort to reveal hidden histories, right? These are histories of people who made up a huge segment of the population. Estimates of number of freedom seekers vary widely, from the tens of thousands to the hundreds of thousands of people. And much of their history it remains hidden. And so this is an effort to expose, to reveal that hidden history. And I was invited it's almost 20 years ago now, by the Michigan Freedom Trail Commission. There were some documents, an obituary here, some town histories that made mention of some freedom seekers in the region. There were oral accounts. There were locals who were tracing this history and so forth. And so they wanted a more systematic and rigorous examination of this phenomenon as part of their effort to document sites associated with the Underground Railroad. And so I was called in as someone who had that sort of expertise, as someone who was interested in landscapes, was interested in materiality, knew a little bit about the 19th century in Michigan, and we were asked to help to document these sites. And I feel strongly about this work is not only being about the past, right? It's not just about studying the 19th century, but I think it has important lessons to teach us. For one, the way that people collaborated across the color line, right? People of white, people of color, assisting people of color, and so forth, I think has parallels in the present as well, right? So it's a model for ways in which people can work across the color line to achieve social justice in many instances. So that's something else another reason I got involved with it. So I'm going to go through this history part fairly quickly. Probably many of you know this work a lot better than I do and so forth, but there are some important dates in African American history, and I think most of it underscores the horrors of capture and then forced deportation, at least in the early period. We know there was some attention paid, maybe not enough, to 400 years ago, right? In 2019, 400 years ago, the 1619 Project that was underscoring the first Africans that were brought to Jamestown and so forth. Many of you have seen some of these images that show the close packing that took place on these ships and so forth. Upwards of half of the human cargo wouldn't even make it alive to the New World and so forth. And again, places here in the center image showing where people of African descent came from, often first to the Caribbean, and of course parts of South America, and then making their way from those Caribbean colonies to the American Southeast, to the Carolinas, to Georgia, to Florida, to Louisiana, and so forth. So this was a vibrant trade, to be sure. But very early on, right, there was anti-slavery documents that were being published in Massachusetts, right? So there was sometimes there were religious justifications for the abolition of slavery, although religion was also used as a justification to enslave people. But there were societal pressures, I think, among small segments of the population. This is an important aspect, I think. So even as there are these laws put in place to make it legal to enslave people, so too there's a countervailing tendency within society to push up against this. And I think that this is important. But the law was not unimportant and not inconsequential. So the Fugitive Slave Act, for example, outlawed efforts to impede the capture of runaway slaves. So basically, if you were involved in the Underground Railroad and you were helping people out and you got caught, then you could pay a penalty. But here's just an image here of a revolt on the Amistad and so forth, just one of many slave revolts that demonstrate the importance of resistance to enslavement. So that peculiar institution, right? Even after the United States outlawed the importation of Africans, smuggling in humans continued, right? And really the strategy in some places after then focused on really breeding people of African descent to ensure a steady supply, in fact, a growing supply of free labor, free in the sense that it didn't cost people anything. It's really bond labor in bondage and so forth. And, you know, we know events leading up to the Civil War, of course, with having to do with states' rights. You know, these were hotly debated in the 19th century, what states could become slave states and which would not, and so forth. But places like England and other places, right, in the Caribbean, really abolished slavery much earlier than the United States, when you consider that. And so, again, there was this, many people understood that this is wrong. Many people understood that this really flew in the face of any kind of humane understanding of all of us are created equal, right? Or so said the Constitution. But of course, there were lots of caveats there, as we know. So the struggle continued, and it really wasn't until you know, the 1860s that Lincoln freed the slaves, but slavery was really not officially abolished until the 13th Amendment. So again, other aspects of this history that we could delve into, but let's sort of just move on. You know, one of the pieces that I think plagued a lot of our early American fathers, and I'll underscore fathers there, you know, we know that Jefferson and Washington and others were enslavers and so forth. And this must have weighed on their conscience, right? It most certainly did. Because how, on the one hand, could they say they can assert the equality of all humans and yet enslave huge segments of the population? And one of the ways they assuaged themselves, assuaged their consciences, and resolved the contradictions of enslavement was really through biology, right? So they came to believe in ideas that, in fact, some groups were just not destined to freedom. They had innate characteristics that didn't allow them the intelligence or the degree of thrift, or you know, were generally lazy and so forth, and just incapable, right, of benefiting fully. And so they would be hewers of wood, right, and that would be their role and so forth. And this biological basis for human differences lasted for a long time. Indeed, there are some people who still believe it to this day, despite the work of anthropologists and others to demonstrate that, in fact, there is no biological basis for race. But it's not to say that race and racism isn't very real. So again, without getting into too much detail here, the harsh treatment, the arduous labor regime, the squalor of daily life, right? Would we ever have to ask, why would anybody want to escape, right? I mean, it's patently obvious, although the risks were tremendously, you know, were extremely severe, right? Because even if you got away, right, your family that was left back, you know, could be punished severely and so forth for the fact that you disappeared and so on. And if you were to be caught, right, you know, the floggings and, you know, you can see examples here and so forth. So this was difficult, and it's clear that people wanted to end this institution, certainly wanted to get away from it. So different forms of resisting enslavement. I mean, here on the right, this little cartoon, and then below that is one of these runaway slave advertisements. Let's see, from the undersigned, living on Current River, about 12 miles. It's about 30 years old, weighs about 160 pounds, high forehead with a scar on it, right? So again, as I mentioned earlier, right, there's a reward. So anyway, to emphasize the agency of the enslaved, I mean, these are the people who took the risks, right? The ultimate risks, because they could be treated even more harshly than they had been, or they could, in fact, be killed. I mean, with no retribution whatsoever. In fact, any white man could raise a hand to any black man, so to speak, under these conditions. The way people resisted were sometimes through suicide and infanticide. I only want to raise my child in a world like this, right? To kill their own children and so on, because of how horrendous this system was. Mutiny on slave ships, I mentioned that earlier. And then these other sort of forms of, what James Scott referred to as the weapons of the weak, right? These forms of daily resistance, such as poisoning work animals, right? Or destroying property, right? Just ways to get back, if you will, at the enslaver. Feigning illness, right? To try to get a half a day out of work or something from going into the fields or whatever your task was. Work slowdowns. And of course, the ultimate form of resistance was an effort to self-liberate and the Underground Railroad. So there are lots of so-called Maroon settlements. I mean, these are places where people who had formerly been enslaved collected and begin to form their own little society and so forth. There's a great example. One of my former students, Dan Sayers, has worked on a project for many years in the Great Dismal Swamp between North Carolina and Virginia, right? And a place where he was able to detect traces of small settlements that were probably occupied by African Americans. It was places where the enslavers didn't want to go into the swamp to try to reclaim their so-called property and so forth. Fort Mose on the fringes of the British Empire, sort of allowed in some ways, as a buffer between the Spanish and the English. I mean, it's a very interesting history of Fort Mose that you could look into. In New Jersey, in Kansas, in Brazil, very famous site of Palmares in Brazil. Upwards of hundreds and hundreds of people there with, permanent architecture, essentially a city with its own laws and so on. In Randolph County, right, some work that Deb Rotman, one of my former students, has done right in your own area of Indiana here in East Central Indiana. And the one I want to talk about today is in Cass County, Michigan, right, a place where freedom seekers came to settle, if not permanently, at least for a while, to create a sense of community. So how do we go about searching for evidence of the Underground Railroad? What are the sources that we employed in our work? Well, for any historian, I'm not a historian by training, but for any historian, I think you probably want to begin with in a new area of inquiry, right, with secondary sources, right? So what do people have to say, even if they didn't observe it? So we consulted town histories, several town histories from the late town and county histories from the late 19th century in Cass County that remarked that there was a place called Ramp Town. There were upwards of 50 cabins or so that were occupied by people of African descent who had escaped bondage and so forth. And a number of secondary sources made reference to this. But that wasn't enough because often they didn't provide any sources, or so we needed to dig a little bit deeper. So we consulted primary sources, and I'll show you some examples of these in a minute. We looked at some census data in Cass County, in Calvin and Penn Townships are the areas we focused on. We looked at some maps. We interviewed some locals. We consulted some private letters that existed in local archives. We collected oral accounts, some of which who had been then recorded, maybe transcribed. And of course, the material remains, right? This is our entry point as archaeologists, is the materiality. Wherever people are, they leave some evidence, right? Unless they're in a place for just fleeting moments, more than likely they have left some traces on the landscape, and that's what we aim to identify. So again, here's this map from your Centennial Handbook, your Centennial History, and it shows a series of routes. Many of you have probably seen this before. Places crossing, the Ohio River, up through in Indiana. And these are probably not the only two. Jeannie and I were talking about this earlier. These are probably not the only two routes, if you will. As a matter of fact, Cass County would sort of be in this area, if you can see my cursor, or it'd be, in other words, just a little bit to the east of Niles, about where the S is in Niles. There's a little creek that runs up here called Christiana Creek. We have reason to believe that's probably a little route that some people may have used to make their way north to Cass County. And then from there, they could go on to Kalamazoo, to Battle Creek, and then there's a whole string of settlements and the network of the Underground Railroad continues east in that location, and this is well documented through various so-called conductors on the Underground Railroad, people who were known to have assisted in this clandestine activity. So here's some census data on Cass County, broken down here by township. The point is just that, in 1840, there aren't many, if any, people of African American descent, but the number, increases quite rapidly right up through about 1860. Right, when you consider, and again, there were problems with these data. I mean, people would be recorded, their racial identity would be recorded differently from one census to another. There's phrases like mulatto and black and so on and so forth. But as best as we can tell, the point is that there is certainly an increase in the African American population in Cass County. Now you might ask, well, were all these people involved in the Underground Railroad? Well, probably. We know that there were free blacks as well, right? So it's difficult to parse this out completely, but it is suggestive. And that's what I'm really presenting to you, a series of lines of evidence that I think allow us to make the case that, in fact, there was activity there, and we've been able to identify some of it. So this is the area that we're talking about. Probably should have another locator map to show you where this is. But I just showed you it's essentially just north, I think, as the crow flies from here to the Indiana border, might be on the order, I'm just estimating now, let's say maybe 12, 15 or 20 miles, I'm thinking. And here's the town of Vandalia shown on the right. But I show you this to point out the land ownership of various Quakers who lived in this area. So you can look on this map, and I hope you can read it. You can see the name James Bonine in a number of areas. And James Bonine was particularly active in the Underground Railroad. as was William Jones, shown here, and a number of other individuals. Stephen Bogue, right? The Bogue family. Here's Stephen Bogue, and this is one of his offspring and so forth. And they intermarried and so forth. And there are also free blacks living in this area as well, who were active in this. We don't know as much about them because they're not documented in the same way. And I'll come back to that map in a minute. So as I alluded to, who was involved in this? Well, yes, Quakers were involved in it. There's no denying that. Here's the home of Nathan Thomas. This is actually in Schoolcraft, Michigan, not in the region where we're talking about, but a little bit further to the east. But this is the home of James Bonine. So I don't know if it ever looked this good. I mean, this has now been restored by the local Cass County Underground Railroad Society. And, it's a lovely building. The downstairs is sort of restored to its kind of 1860s, 1870s appearance. And then the upstairs is a research center focused on the Underground Railroad in the area and so forth. So that's been a project that's been ongoing for about the last 15 years or so. And so that was the home of James Bonine. There's a carriage house immediately across the street, sort of like where we're standing taking this photograph. And there are reports that people would congregate there as sort of a source of labor. And then they would be parceled off on a daily basis and so forth. But somewhere on the Bonine property and probably elsewhere, there were people who had been enslaved, who were living on the landscape in a settlement called Ramptown, and maybe elsewhere as well. So, and let me support that a little further with some other evidence. So here's some maps, right, showing the locations of Ramptown, this Maroon community. And I can show you, so this is M60. So we were standing right on M60 when we took the photo, when I showed you that photo of the, of the Bonine house. And it's basically right on the corner here. And this is a hand-drawn map from a descendant of the Bonines that shows Ramptown. Shows some activity here. And then here's another hand-drawn map that shows Ramptown. And here's another map. Right, this is actually in a dissertation from the 1960s, I think it is. That shows Ramptown, but it shows it here north of M60. So there's some discrepancy about precisely where it was located, but most of the folks at the Cass County Historical Underground Railroad Society, believe that its place with Ramptown is in this area. So, and here's the area that's been identified by local consultants. Obviously no standing architecture or anything at this point. Most of Cass County is in agriculture. So as you might know, that's a mixed blessing for archaeologists. The downside is that stuff gets plowed up and disturbed. And the upside is stuff gets plowed up and visible to the naked eye on the surface. So these were our methods, right, to search for this lost settlement. First off, Cass County's a big place. I mean, Calvin and Penn Township are big areas. You just start walking, and I'd still be walking, right, if we didn't narrow it down somewhat. So archaeologists typically try to identify high potential areas. So some of the areas we thought would be fairly high potential, first would be the Quaker properties, right? We also had access to some local collections, right? We had spoken to a woman, octogenarian at the time. She remembered as a child in the 1920s, her mother talking about this place called Ramptown. She went over to that area. She found some ceramics that she kept in like the proverbial cigar box. And I'll show you some images of that. So we're like, well, it's, again, a good place to start. And then we also consulted and employed the maps that we had at our disposal, as well as other sources. So we're using the historical documents that are and oral accounts and so forth as a way to narrow down, right, the areas that we would focus on. So then we needed to contact landowners, right, because we wanted access to their property. We want to be able to look on their property. And this work was done in spring. And so farmers were starting to plow and, so we're under time constraints. And well, the short story is we managed to get access to about 700 acres, right? So that might sound like a lot of space, but it's not a lot of space in the context of, Calvert and Penn townships, but it was a start, right? And the idea is for us to walk in these plowed fields and document any material evidence we find, right? So we're not so much interested in, Budweiser bottles that were thrown out of somebody's window, of course, but we're trying to hone in on materials that may perhaps date to the period when this activity was taking place. So these are the ceramics that our friend Virginia Springsteen, the octogenarian, now deceased, she had these and some other ceramics. So those of you know something about pottery, either from an archaeological or decorative art standpoint, or you have a collection from your great maybe grandmother. So this is blue shell-edged earthenware, and this was a type of ceramic that was typical in the mid-19th century. So the age is right anyway. So here's some others then that we collected in our survey. So if I get my cursor going here, you can see some blue shell edge here and blue shell edge here. This is green shell edged pottery. And this is transfer printed ceramic, right? And so, again, these date to the right period. So here's more ceramics found in some other sites, and I'll talk about more about the sites where we found these in a minute. I'm just sort of showing you the collection at this point. So these are all mid to late 19th century ceramics, and these complete specimens are not from our survey. Let me emphasize, they are not from our survey. The reason I show them to you is that it would not have been unusual in the 1840s, the 1850s, the 1860s, certainly for someone like Bonine, for example, right, to have ceramics that were in a matched set, right? So he would have these plates, and there would be bowls, there would be cups and saucers, and so on and so forth. That would not, that would not be unexpected right at that time. But what's interesting is the ceramics that we find are unmatched, right? So here's some spongeware, here's some yellowware, here's some banded pottery, some hand painted, right? More spongeware, it looks like here. So it doesn't look like any of these match. So we also recovered some of these glazed earthenware storage vessel fragments and some glass. And again, based on the color and the characteristics of this glass, some of these seem like they could be contemporaneous with those ceramics. So here's our survey findings. In those 700 acres where we walked these plowed fields, we identified 12 artifact concentrations. 8 of them contain domestic debris, right? So this is, in other words, household debris like pottery and glass that you might expect to find around someone's cabin, right? Interestingly, these were quite consistent in size. They were like 30 to 40 meters in diameter, right? So it wasn't as if they were like spread out over the entire field, or they were just concentrated like in a little, several meter area and so on. So it looked like the kind of scatter you might find maybe after the site had been plowed. because these had been plowed, in the vicinity of a domestic structure and so forth. They all date to the mid to late 19th century, right, the ceramics. And they are from unmatched sets. So this maybe is what we might expect of these freedom seekers who maybe are obtaining the ceramics piecemeal. Maybe they're getting hand-me-downs, right? Or they're maybe purchasing one at a time and so forth, or they're making do with what they can access, right? So that's consistent. The other thing is all these clusters of artifacts are on the margins of fields, right? They're not in the middle of the fields and so on. They're on the margins of fields, suggests where maybe people would have been placing these households. And perhaps most critical, they're in what I would call undocumented locations. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look again at this map. So I mentioned here, let's get ourselves situated here, the Bonine property here. Here's M60 coming out of Vandalia. And right here, that's the home of James Bonine. And this is the home of William Jones. And this is the home of Stephen Bogue. The point is that these landowners, when this plat map was made, right, their houses are plotted on these maps. They are the official landowners and so forth. All of those concentrations of domestic debris that we found, of all of them, none of them coincide with any of these domestic structures. So they're like, located, not, again, this is kind of meta, just as an example, they're sort of like located here. There is no building there. So we suspect that when these plat maps were made, and we have one from the 1860 as well as one from 1872. So it's not as if, well, by 1872, all of them were torn down. I have a plat map from 1860 as well. And again, same sort of thing. So this suggests to us that whoever was making this map was not really mapping, right, these houses, these households of folks who had escaped and who were the freedom seekers and so forth, even though they likely were residing, right, on this landscape. And this is the location where Ramptown supposedly was located, and there are no buildings whatsoever shown there. And part of that area was wooded, and we weren't really able to conduct a complete survey in that area. So further work will obviously be needed. But generally speaking, we looked at about 700 acres in this area, and those were the results. So what do these places look like? Well, it's hard to say, right? We're just imagining now Underground Railroad settlements in Southwest Michigan, right? They might not have even been as permanent as some of these buildings, right? With chimneys. Obviously, if people are going to live there through a Michigan winter, right, you would have wanted to heat these houses. Maybe small gardens, right, outside. Maybe a privy. Maybe some storage pits beneath the beneath the house floors and so forth. So these are just some potential depictions of these sort of small cabins that people could have readily erected and occupied during this period, and then threw trash out the backyard. I mean, this was not an uncommon practice, even for someone like Bonine. So this is not an Underground Railroad site. What archaeology can potentially reveal once we actually put a shovel in the ground. We've been digging in the archives, we've been digging in people's memories and so forth. We haven't really done any digging whatsoever, right? But what we might expect is some footprint of any of these structures that were constructed, wells or trash pits, perhaps, or privies, or that sort of thing. So here's my summary and what I would argue would be some logical future directions. So our survey was the first systematic effort to locate material remains associated with formerly enslaved people of African descent in the state of Michigan. There has, even to this day, I don't know if there's been much more work done in this area. These sites are extremely elusive, and it's often just difficult to make the case in the absence of oral histories and supporting written records and so on and so forth. So our finds were confined to our pedestrian survey. In other words, we walked on the surface of the ground. We placed flags in locations where we found artifacts. We then mapped those locations and then collected the artifacts. Some nails, some glass, some ceramics, a couple of bricks, and so on, right? There was no excavation at this point. The next step would be to evaluate these sites for their significance. So in other words, we would try to answer the question, do these sites have integrity? Are they undisturbed? We know that these are in plowed fields, as I mentioned before. I mean, some of these sites are, plowed down probably to 30 centimeters, right, to a foot and a half maybe, right? So that kind of agricultural activity could have disturbed these sites to the point where there may be more artifacts there, but their spatial relationships are no longer extant. The site has just been too disturbed. So we would need to establish, are there subsurface features, like I suggested in that earlier slide and so forth? And then what can we learn from investigating those features and the spatial relationships of artifacts in association? In addition to looking at the sites we found more intensively, I would argue that there's a need for more extensive survey. I mean, we only looked at 700 acres, right? There's a lot more space there. We should go back and scrutinize that area where those maps suggest Ramtown might be located, and look more closely in that area. And if it's wooded, we might not see anything on the ground surface. And so another technique we have in our disposal, in our toolkit, is conducting shovel test pitting, right? So digging small holes at 10-meter intervals and so forth, and screening all the sediment through a mesh, and seeing if we find ceramics and bricks and other evidence that dates to that period that can suggest there might be human activity there. I think continued archival research and comparisons with other African-American sites would also be very useful, right? But there has been very little of this type of archaeology done at these sites. I mean, the types of sites that have been located have been some hiding places and that sort of thing. I'm thinking of an example in Pennsylvania where an old cistern had been abandoned, and there was a spittoon, and there were some other items in there. There was a bricked up part of it where people could have entered it, and then later it was bricked up and so forth. And so, these kinds of hiding places and so on, but they're few and far between as well. But doing some kind of comparative study would certainly be helpful. And like I said, a deeper dive into the archival research as well would be very useful. And I think this work should inspire us, right, by providing lessons for the future on how to work across the color line to challenge injustice. I mean, people did it in the 19th century. And as we investigated the sites today in the project, again, it was people of color and white people like me who were working for a common cause, to understand this phenomenon and to bring to light these hidden histories. So just trying to advance my slides here. Lots of people were involved in these projects. Were invited, as I said, by the Michigan Freedom Trail Commission. Lots of individuals contributed ideas to this, including my student Amanda Campbell. So I thank you for listening, and I'm happy to address any questions you might have about the Underground Railroad in Southwest Michigan.
All right, well, hopefully my microphone keeps working. First, one person noted they wanted to thank you for the presentation. It was fascinating and they learned a lot. So thank you very much there. Someone else said, enslavers may have thought Africans were incapable of being equal to white men, with whites being superior to Africans. Was the solidification of white supremacy in this country. So she thinks the attitudes of enslavement and enslavers continues today. It's more about
here. Yeah. Yeah. Was that in the form of a question? I mean, I think
she was just making a statement.
Yeah, well, I would support that completely. Again, early on in the history, the distinction was not along the color line, right? There were indentured servants and there were enslaved, but it was really in the late 17th and early 18th century where this crystallizes and it became people of color that were the enslaved, and there was no getting out of that status and so forth. So the piece of our biology that I talked about, I think, is part of that white supremacy piece as well. So I'm glad person called that out, and I appreciate that.
Someone asked if there are any excavated Underground Railroad sites to visit today.
Not that I know of.
I will state in Indiana, you can go to the Levi and Catherine Coffin House, which is a state historic site over in Wayne County. And they've done some excavation at the site, not a lot. I'd love for them to do more. But that's the only one in Indiana that's open to the public that's had archaeology done to it.
Yeah, and of course, that's important work. And in that case, it's really going to tell us about the life of the conductor, right? And yes, less so about the freedom seekers. And what I was trying to emphasize here was certainly the freedom seekers. But yeah, I think, the conductors have been recognized, certainly, with plaques and monuments, and their houses have been preserved and so forth. There are a number of those in Michigan. And that's a place to start. What's really difficult to get information on are the people themselves, the people who were the freedom seekers themselves.
Next person asked, did the most of the enslaved people continue to Canada, or did they just settle in Michigan?
Yeah, so one of my students wrote a piece when he was doing some work in Battle Creek, and it was called "We weren't just passing through," right? So I think there is evidence that some of these folks did settle down. In the case of Cass County, today there is a large African-American presence in and around Vandalia, but it doesn't look to be people who derived from these freedom seekers. It looks like sometime in the 1870s, 80s, for whatever reason, these folks moved on, and the folks who are there today are a more recent migration in the early 20th century. So there's a bit of a disjuncture there and so forth. But that's not to say that there aren't other places where people aren't descended. But it was still, it wasn't safe. I didn't talk much about, those of you who are interested in getting more into this, the very famous Kentucky slave raid of 1847 took place in Cass County, where Kentucky enslavers came to Cass County to claim their property and so on. And it didn't end well. And there was a long court case around it. But ultimately the people they came to try to get were moved on, right? They were under cover of darkness, right? They were put in a wagon and taken to points east and so forth. So I think, the real promised land was in many cases Canada. It's not to say that everybody ended up there, but that's how I would address that.
Someone asked if there's any evidence of Underground Railroad sites in South Bend and with their connections to Cass County. I can say yes, because I run the Underground Railroad Initiative for our office here. And we have been talking, Dr. Nassaney and I have been talking about some of the connections and some of the names. And so we're going to continue that conversation, but the answer is yes. And you can find stuff on our website with the DNR, definitely to continue that.
Yeah, and I would add, I wouldn't be surprised because, as I mentioned Niles, I actually worked on 18th century history in Niles, but 19th century Niles history also has Underground Railroad activity. So that's just a stone's throw, of course, from South Bend. So I'm sure there are linkages there, to be sure.
Asked if you've been in conversation with the National Parks Service's Underground Railroad Network to Freedom.
Yes, as a matter of fact, we have. I'm a commissioner. I serve on the Michigan Freedom Trail Commission. And the commission are a set of appointees by the governor who are charged with identifying, interpreting, and using for educational purposes documented Underground Railroad sites in the state of Michigan. So yeah, we're in touch with the Midwestern office. We work closely with them. And we've been developing a network of Underground Railroad aficionados and researchers throughout the state of Michigan over the last few years. And stay tuned for that. And we're hoping to pull in other states as well. Let me also add a plug that our governor, that woman from Michigan, as she's often been referred to, proclaimed September Underground Railroad Month in the state of Michigan. So we're hoping that proclamation will come again next year and be permanent. And then this will be an opportunity to really highlight some of this work during that period.
We've got some more questions, so if you're willing to stay on for a few more minutes and get through these questions, that'd be great. Why were African-American settlements referred to as Maroon settlements?
So this is derives from a Spanish word, right? Maroonage, right? Of basically meaning of escape, right? It's actually from the word cimarron, right? Meaning these folks who have escaped bondage and so forth. So that's kind of the etymology of it. And it's still with us. So,
were there metal artifacts found, and did you use or have access to GPR, ground penetrating radar, and similar technologies?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there were a few metal artifacts, but not many. It's not uncommon on the surface of the ground. It would be uncommon for some of those items to actually preserve, although it wouldn't be impossible. Typically, in what we would call a phase 1 survey, in other words, our initial search, we would not use those kinds of geophysical techniques because the area is so huge. In the next stage, what we would call like a phase 2 or a more intensive survey, we'd go to those areas where the artifacts were found, and then we would use ground penetrating radar or magnetometry and these sorts of techniques that could help us to identify places that might have subsurface remains.
Can you talk about the role of the abolitionists after the Civil War? Was there any help to help these individuals?
That's a good question, and I don't know much about that period. So what were James Benign and Stephen Bogue and the rest of those folks and their descendants? I think, some of them who are active in the 40s and 50s, probably were not alive during Reconstruction necessarily, but what their descendants might have been doing. Again, the impression we got, though, at least for the area we focused on, that by about 1870, let's say 1880, there was a decrease in the population of people of color in Calvin and Penn townships. Now, why they left, where they went, was that indeed the case? Those are questions to be studied further.
Are there any Canadian centers to visit?
I can say just a very little bit about that. Since being a commissioner, I've wanted to learn more about this. My expertise is actually French colonial archaeology. So I did travel, let's see, I guess it was a couple summers ago. to Amherstburg and a couple other places in Ontario. And let's see, what drew us there is one of the churches was having like a fundraiser. It was like jazz and barbecue and stuff like that. And we went, we attended that, and we saw the museum there. We met some of the people. And there, the folks that were running this event are descended from people who were freedom seekers. And another place is Buxton. And if you Google, Underground Railroad, the present, contemporary African-American settlements in Lower Ontario, all those places will pop up for sure. And yeah, we spent a weekend there, and it's well worth checking out. And on your way, if you're coming from through Michigan, the Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit is a good place to learn about African American history as kind of an entree into more study into these sites.
Someone said that the artifact signatures are similar to the appearance that Dr. Schur out of Notre Dame is doing with the historic sites. And so do you see a connection between this hidden population, mismatched ceramics, no structures on the plat maps?
Yeah. So, I know the work that Dr. Schur has been doing is a little bit earlier, like maybe the 1830s, during that sort of removal period, but some maybe, may overlap a little bit. I think one of the challenges for identifying both native sites from that period, let's say the first half of the 19th century, as well as these sites, is I think they may have been located, identified, located and recorded. And I think they've been confused with early pioneer sites in some instances, right? Because you got to figure now, I mean, in 1830s, native peoples are not, they're not using stone tools, they're not making their own ceramics. And so their assemblage, similarly with people of African descent, is basically very similar to the assemblages of white pioneers. But as I tried to point out in this instance, white pioneers more than likely would have matched ceramic sets. And here there's just a mishmash of all different ceramics. So the things like that, subtle differences like that might be clues as to the identity of the people responsible for these sites. And then you and I were talking earlier, just to say briefly, the connection between freedom seekers and Native Americans. So they were interacting in places, and you might put the pitch out for that session next week. I don't have the details at my fingertips, but I know one of my colleagues on the Michigan Freedom Trail Commission will be speaking about Native Americans and their role in the Underground Railroad Act.
And so next Tuesday at noon, the Park Service, the Network to Freedom program, is putting on a program with the Detroit Black Abolitionists archives on Underground Railroad and Native Americans. It is on our Facebook page. So if you go to DHPA's Facebook page, you can find a link to that. I'm not sure if you just Google it. But so if you're interested in that, that's one good. We've got time for one more question, and I think it's kind of good overarching. If I have a building that I think has been used, how do I get started to get it evaluated, and who do I reach out to?
Okay, great question. You can in Michigan or in Indiana, the equivalent, you can contact your Freedom Trail Commission, right? And they can provide you with some guidance. Not to make light of this, but when we got into this work, what we found as you start talking to people is, again, not to make light of this, I respect people's beliefs about their own history. But we ran across so many stories of folks who knew about houses that their uncles lived in, that had a tunnel, that was on the Underground Railroad, and so on and so forth. And look, it's obviously some of these sites fit that bill, but the stories were rampant, right? And so part of the role of the national network, the national network, is to identify those sites that are bona fide, that indeed were linked to the Underground Railroad. So that takes a tremendous amount of documentary and other forms of research and so forth. But it's important work, and documenting those sites is important. So I don't discount any story at the outset. But for example, if you hear that story and then you go and you see the house and, it dates to the 1920s, then, it's a no-go. Or the other example would be, you would say, well, can I see that house? Oh, that house just got torn down. Oh, can I talk to your uncle? Oh, he just moved to Arizona. So it's difficult to trace this. And I think there are more stories than there are real sites related to the Underground Railroad. And this is what we're trying to sort out.
All right, well, I've got a couple more questions that people answer. What we'll do is we can send those, we'll send an email to you and stuff like that, answering your stuff, because there's a lot more questions that can be asked, but we have to respect everyone's time today. And so I want to thank you for participating, and hopefully we can find some more connections between Indiana and Michigan.
Very good.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you also.